A millionaire cowboy hears wealthy women laugh at a widow's little girl because of the old dress
Look at
she's
those
wearing.
absolute
They
rags.
think nobody will challenge them. They are wrong. Because the man standing quietly in the corner of the store is about to make a decision that will expose a cruel scheme, save a family's home, and leave the entire town speechless. The winter of 1883 had settled over Clearwater like a heavy blanket. The bitter wind had stripped the elm trees bare, and every morning frost covered the wooden sidewalks and wagon wheels. Inside Higgins' Mercantile, however, the cast-iron stove kept the room warm. The store smelled of coffee, leather, flour, and old pine. It was the busiest place in town during the cold months. And that morning, 10-year-old Nellie Thornton was trying very hard to become invisible. She stood beside the fabric counter with her hands folded behind her back. Her blonde hair was tied into two neat braids that fell down her back. But the dress she wore was impossible to hide. It was an oversized gray wool dress that had once belonged to an older girl. The elbows were worn thin. The hem had been taken up and let down so many times that a faint, jagged line ran around the bottom. One of the buttons had been replaced with a mismatched iron button. Nellie knew the dress was old. She knew it was too big. She knew the other children in town sometimes stared at it. But she never complained. Her mother had done everything she could to keep her warm. That was enough. A few feet away, Nellie's mother, Cora Thornton, was counting coins into her palm. Cora was a widow. Her hands were rough from washing clothes in freezing water. Her back hurt from carrying firewood. And every dollar she earned disappeared almost immediately into food, repairs, and the growing debt attached to their farm. "Half a sack of oats, Mr. Higgins," she said quietly. "And 1 tin of lard." Mr. Higgins nodded. He was a decent man, but business was business. He collected the coins and began preparing the order. While her mother waited, Nellie noticed something across the room. A bolt of bright red flannel sat on the fabric shelf. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The color was rich and warm. To Nellie, it looked like Christmas. It looked like a fireplace on a freezing night. Without thinking, she slowly raised her hand. Her fingers stopped just an inch above the fabric. She didn't touch it. Her mother had taught her never to handle something they couldn't afford, so Nellie simply looked. Then the front door opened. A blast of winter air swept through the store. 2 women stepped inside wearing expensive coats, fur collars, and hats decorated with dyed feathers. Harriet Gable and Eunice Croft were the wives of 2 of Clearwater's wealthiest merchants. They were accustomed to being admired. They were accustomed to getting what they wanted. And they were certainly accustomed to feeling superior to people like Cora Thornton. Harriet walked toward the fabric counter. She noticed the red flannel first. Then she noticed Nellie. Her eyes traveled slowly from the girl's blonde braids to the worn elbows of her dress, then down to the crooked hem. Harriet smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "Beautiful fabric," she said. Nellie looked up. "Yes, ma'am." "It's imported," Eunice said. $4 a yard. Nellie nodded politely. "I'm sure it's very nice." Harriet laughed softly. "I'm having a winter coat made for my niece," Eunice continued. Nellie stepped back to give them room. She'd already learned that some people didn't like poor children standing too close to expensive things. Harriet looked at the red fabric again. Then she looked at Nellie. "It certainly isn't fabric for a farm girl." Nellie's smile disappeared. Harriet tilted her head. "Although, looking at you, child, I suppose almost any fabric would be an improvement." Eunice covered her mouth. Then she laughed. It was a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed beneath the tin ceiling. "Oh, Harriet," she said. "She looks like she's wearing a potato sack that was left outside in the rain." The women laughed again. Nellie lowered her eyes. She didn't cry. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. But her shoulders tightened. She wished she could disappear between the wooden floorboards. At the counter, Cora heard every word. Her hands tightened around the edge of the counter. For a moment, she wanted to turn around. She wanted to tell those women exactly what she thought of them. But she couldn't. Harriet Gable's husband bought eggs from her. Eunice Croft's husband bought milk. Cora couldn't afford to make enemies of the people who controlled half her income, so she swallowed her anger. "Nellie," she said quietly. The little girl hurried over. "We're leaving." Cora picked up the sack of oats. She took her daughter's hand. Together, they walked toward the door. Neither woman apologized. Neither woman looked ashamed. They simply continued laughing. The heavy door closed behind Cora and Nellie. Neither of them noticed the tall man standing near the stove. His name was Josiah Langdon. Everyone in Clearwater knew his name. Josiah owned Broken Ridge Ranch, a sprawling property 20 miles outside town. He employed 40 ranch hands. His cattle traveled by railroad all the way to Chicago. He had accumulated enough wealth to buy most of the businesses in Clearwater if he wanted to. But he didn't look like a millionaire. He wore a faded canvas coat. His leather chaps were covered with trail dust. His wide-brimmed hat was old and weathered. He looked like an ordinary cowboy. But Josiah had heard everything. He had seen Nellie looking at the red flannel. He had seen the women laugh. And he had watched Cora swallow her anger to protect her daughter. That last part bothered him most. Josiah had a daughter of his own. Her name was Eliza. She was 9 years old. Since Josiah's wife had died, Eliza was the center of his world. And he knew exactly how he would feel if someone looked at his daughter the way those women had looked at Nellie. He slowly turned toward Harriet and Eunice. They were still smiling, still admiring the red fabric, still completely unaware that they had just made an enemy of the most powerful man in the county. Josiah walked toward the counter. His boots struck the wooden floor one step at a time. Harriet looked up. Her smile weakened. "Mr. Langdon," she said. "Cold morning, isn't it?" Josiah didn't answer. He looked at the red flannel. Then he looked at Mr. Higgins. "How much is on that bolt?" Higgins glanced at it. "About 40 yards, sir." "I'll take it." Harriet blinked. "All of it?" Josiah finally looked at her. "You were planning to buy 5 yards, weren't you?" "Yes." "But you were too busy laughing to open your purse." Harriet's face turned red. Josiah pulled a thick roll of bills from inside his coat. He counted out the money and placed it on the counter. "Wrap the whole bolt." Mr. Higgins immediately obeyed. Josiah picked up the receipt. Then he walked out into the freezing morning. The store became completely silent. Outside, Josiah could still see Cora and Nellie walking down the road. Their heads were bowed against the wind. He watched them disappear around the corner. He had come to Clearwater that morning to sign an important grazing contract at the bank. But suddenly the contract didn't seem important anymore. Something else had caught his attention. Josiah untied his horse and rode toward Clearwater Bank. The bank was a red brick building with thick glass windows and heavy oak doors. Inside, it was warm. Arthur Gable sat behind the main desk. He was Harriet's husband. He was also the bank manager. When Josiah entered, Arthur immediately stood. "Mr. Langdon," he said with a practiced smile, "I have the grazing contract ready for your signature." Josiah didn't sit down. "I'm not here for the contract." Arthur's smile faded slightly. "Is there a problem with the terms?" "No." Josiah placed both hands on the polished desk. "I want to see the Thornton note." Arthur froze. "The Thornton note?" "Yes." "I'm afraid I can't discuss another customer's private account." "Show me the ledger, Arthur." Arthur swallowed. He knew better than to argue. He opened a drawer and pulled out a heavy leather-bound ledger. He turned several pages and slid it across the desk. Josiah looked down. The original Thornton loan had been only $200. Cora's late husband had borrowed the money to buy seed and repair the barn, but the balance now stood at nearly $450. Josiah narrowed his eyes. "What are these charges?" "Standard interest." "And these?" "Late penalties." Josiah traced his finger down the page. "She missed the payment by $3. Arthur shifted in his chair. "She missed the full amount 3 times. By $3. Rules are rules, Mr. Langdon." "And you charged her $20 each time?" Arthur stiffened. "The bank has to protect its investments." Josiah closed the ledger. The sound echoed through the room. Now he understood. This wasn't about a few dollars. Arthur Gable wanted the Thornton farm. And there was a reason. The Thornton property sat in one of the most valuable sections of the valley. The new railroad was coming through. The creek running across the Thornton property supplied the water the railroad would need. Arthur didn't want Cora's money. He wanted her land. Josiah reached into his coat. He pulled out the same roll of cash. Then he counted out $450. He placed the money directly on the ledger. The debt is paid. Arthur stared at him. Mr. Langdon, you can't simply. I just did. This is highly irregular. Write the receipt. Arthur's hand shook as he picked up his pen. He wrote the receipt. He stamped it. Then he handed it to Josiah. Josiah folded it carefully and put it inside his coat. Before leaving, he leaned toward Arthur. If I hear that you have added false penalties to another working family's account, I'll pull every Broken Ridge dollar out of this bank. Arthur's face went pale. And I'll tell every rancher in this valley why. Josiah walked out. The cold air felt cleaner than the air inside the bank. His wagon was waiting outside. In the back sat the enormous boat of red flannel. Josiah climbed in, but he didn't immediately return to the ranch. He turned the wagon toward the Thornton farm. 2 miles outside Clearwater stood a small farmhouse surrounded by dark pine trees. The paint had peeled away from the siding. The porch sagged on one side, but the yard was spotless. Firewood was stacked neatly against the wall. Inside, Cora sat at the kitchen table. Her sewing box was open. Nellie's gray dress lay across her lap. Cora was trying to repair the frayed hem. She had run out of gray thread, so she was using black. Nellie sat nearby, reading a school book. Ma. Yes, sweetheart. Did Grandpa Silas really hold the bridge all by himself? Cora looked toward the old wooden box resting on the fireplace mantel. Inside were her father's cavalry medal and a faded piece of parchment. No, Cora said. He wasn't alone. He had good men beside him. Nellie turned another page. Mrs. Gable said pride doesn't keep you warm. Cora stopped sewing. The words hurt, not because Harriet was right, but because her daughter had heard them. Cora looked at Nellie. She's right about one thing. Nellie looked up. Pride doesn't keep you warm. But she's wrong about everything else. What do you mean? Cora smiled gently. Pride doesn't keep you warm. Dignity keeps you standing. You can have cold hands and still have a strong spine. Nellie thought about that. Then she nodded. I don't mind the dress, Ma. It wasn't true. They both knew it. But it was a brave lie. A lie born from love. Before Cora could answer, the family dog began barking. Cora stood. She looked through the frosted window. A large wagon was coming up the road. 2 dark horses pulled it. Cora's stomach tightened. A wagon usually meant the bank, or the tax collector. She opened the door. Cold air rushed inside. Josiah Langdon climbed down from the wagon. Beside him was his daughter, Eliza. Then Josiah reached into the back of the wagon. He pulled out the enormous bolt of red flannel. Cora stared. Mr. Langdon? Mrs. Thornton. Josiah removed his hat. I apologize for arriving without notice. Have my cows broken your fence? No, ma'am. They haven't. Cora looked at the fabric, then back at Josiah. If you come to offer charity, Mr. Langdon, you can turn around. Josiah shook his head. I'm not a man who gives charity. Cora frowned. I'm a man who makes investments. Investments? Josiah lifted the bolt of fabric. I heard what happened at the mercantile. Cora's expression hardened. She expected pity. She expected embarrassment. Instead, Josiah looked directly at Nellie. I bought this. Nellie's eyes widened. Why? Because I refused to let Harriet Gable have it. Eliza nodded solemnly. My father says he has no use for 40 yards of red flannel. Josiah looked at his daughter. And she says red isn't her color. Eliza looked down at her boots. It clashes. For the first time that day, Nellie smiled. Josiah turned back to Cora. I need someone to make winter shirts for my ranch hands. I hear you're the finest seamstress on this side of the ridge. Cora understood immediately. He wasn't giving her money. He was giving her work. Work she could accept without shame. I'd like to hire you, Josiah said. Fair wages. Cora stared at the fabric. Then Josiah added quietly, and I'd like you to use the first few yards to make a dress for your daughter. Nellie's eyes became enormous. Consider it a signing bonus. Cora's breath caught. Why are you doing this? Josiah looked at Eliza, then at Nellie. Because a town that laughs at a child needs to be reminded of its manners. He handed the fabric to Cora. She accepted it with both hands. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll expect the shirts by the end of the month." Josiah turned toward his wagon. Then he stopped. His eyes moved across the Thornton property. He studied the creek, the tree line, the slope of the valley. "Mrs. Thornton?" "Yes." "Did your husband own the water rights to that creek?" Cora frowned. "Yes." "Ah." "The deed covers the water all the way to the old marker." Josiah's expression changed. "Have you seen anyone around here lately? Men with surveying equipment?" Cora hesitated. "Last week. 2 men were near the ridge. I walked out with my rifle, and they rode away. I assumed they were lost." Josiah shook his head. "Men like that are never lost." He reached into his coat. He pulled out the receipt from the bank. Then he handed it to Cora. "What is this?" "Your bank loan. It's paid in full." Cora stared at the document. Her hands began to shake. "Mr. Langdon, this is $450. Listen carefully." Josiah's voice became serious. "Arthur Gable has been adding false penalties to your loan. He wants your farm." Cora looked toward the creek. "The railroad is coming through this valley. They aren't going around the mountain. They're coming through here." Cora's face went pale. "Why? Why?" "Because your creek is the key. If Gable gets your land, he controls the only reliable freshwater source for the railroad." Nellie stepped onto the porch. "Ma? Ma?" Her voice trembled. "Are they going to take our house?" Josiah looked at the little girl. "No, Nellie. They are not." Then he looked to Cora. "Lock your doors tonight. Men like Arthur Gable don't give up when there's a fortune at stake. He'll try something else." That evening, the farmhouse felt different. For the first time in months, there was something warm in the kitchen besides the stove. Cora spread the red flannel across the table. She carefully measured it. Then she began cutting. The fabric moved smoothly beneath her scissors. Nellie was supposed to be asleep. Instead, she sat up in her small cot and watched her mother work. "Ma? You should be sleeping. Is Mr. Langdon going to shoot Mr. Gable?" Cora stopped. "No. No. Good men don't shoot people over money. But Grandpa Silas shot people. That was war. This is a valley." Nellie nodded. Cora returned to sewing. Then she smiled faintly. "Besides, I suspect Mr. Langdon knows worse things to do to a banker than shoot him." Nellie seemed satisfied. She lay back down. Within minutes, she was asleep. Cora continued sewing. She worked late into the night. By 3 in the morning, the dress was finished. She held it up. It was beautiful. The collar was high and neat. The sleeves were full. The hem was perfectly straight. She had even used a little black velvet from her sewing box to line the cuffs. It was a dress worthy of the granddaughter of Colonel Silas Thornton. Cora laid it over the back of a chair. Then she walked to the window. The moon hung low over the snow-covered pasture. Everything looked peaceful, but Josiah's warning remained in her mind. Men like him don't give up easily. Cora opened a cabinet. Behind the blankets was her husband's Winchester rifle. She pulled it out. She loaded it. Then she sat in the rocking chair, facing the window. She waited. An hour passed. The wind became quiet. Then the dog barked. Not a friendly bark, a warning. Cora stood. She moved behind the window frame. Through the frosted glass she saw 2 lanterns near the creek. 2 men were walking across her land. One carried a sledgehammer. The other carried a surveyor's stake. Cora immediately understood. They weren't surveying. They were going to destroy the old stone boundary marker. If they moved the marker and placed a new stake farther toward the house, the water rights could be challenged. Arthur Gable didn't need to buy the farm. He only needed to steal the creek. Cora opened the front door. The freezing wind struck her face. She stepped onto the porch. She raised the rifle. "Step away from the water." The men stopped. One shouted back, "Go inside, lady. This is county business." "This is private land," Cora answered. "You're trespassing." The man with the sledgehammer laughed. Not anymore. The bank says the boundary was marked wrong. We're just fixing it. He raised the hammer. Cora aimed. She pulled the trigger. The gunshot exploded across the valley. The bullet struck a thick pine branch above the man's head. Snow came crashing down over both men. The man dropped the hammer. His partner pulled a revolver. Are you crazy? The next one goes lower, Cora said. Her hands were shaking, but the rifle remained steady. The gunman raised his revolver. He aimed toward the porch. Then they heard horses. Heavy hoofbeats thundered through the trees. 4 riders emerged from the darkness. Then another. Then another. At the front was Josiah of Langdon. He was riding a massive black gelding. His ranch foreman Amos rode directly behind him. Josiah drove his horse between the 2 men and the boundary marker. Amos uncoiled a lariat. He threw it. The rope dropped perfectly around the man holding the revolver. Amos jerked hard. The man hit the snow. His gun disappeared into the white powder. Josiah pulled his horse to a stop. The animal breathed clouds of steam into the cold air. Josiah looked down at the man who had dropped the hammer. Pick it up. The man stared at him. I said, pick it up. The terrified man reached down. He grabbed the sledgehammer. Now walk back to town. Josiah pointed toward the road. If you stop before reaching the bank, Amos will drag you the rest of the way. The man looked at Amos. Amos smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. The 2 men hurried away. Josiah turned his horse toward the farmhouse. Cora was still standing on the porch. Her rifle was smoking. Josiah looked at it. Then at her. I told you to lock your doors, Mrs. Thornton. I did. But they were outside. A small smile appeared on Josiah's face. He tipped his hat. Colonel Silas would have been proud of that shot. Cora lowered the rifle. Her hands were beginning to tremble now that the danger had passed. Did you know they were coming? I suspected Arthur Gable was a coward. Cowards usually do their dirty work in the dark. Cora looked toward the creek. They were trying to move the marker. I know. The railroad sent its final surveyor yesterday. He files his official report tomorrow morning. Gable needed that marker moved before sunrise. Cora looked at Josiah. What happens now? Josiah looked toward Clearwater. Now the sun comes up, and we go see the banker. Morning arrived bright and cold. The sky was pale blue. By the time the mercantile opened, people were already gathering. Harriet Gable and Eunice Croft stood near the stove, gossiping about the upcoming winter social. They had no idea what had happened during the night. Across the street, Arthur Gable sat behind his desk. He kept looking toward the window. He was waiting for his men. He expected them to return with good news. Instead, he saw something that made his stomach drop. A heavy wagon was coming down Main Street. Josiah Langdon was driving. Beside him sat Cora Thornton. Behind them rode 6 cowboys from Broken Ridge Ranch. The wagon stopped directly in front of the bank. The entire town seemed to go quiet. The blacksmith stopped hammering. People stepped out of the mercantile. Everyone wanted to know what was happening. Josiah climbed down. He helped Cora out. Then Nellie stood up from the back of the wagon. Josiah reached up and gently lifted her to the ground. And that's when the crowd saw it. Nellie was no longer wearing the oversized gray dress. She was wearing the new red flannel dress. The deep red fabric caught the morning sunlight. The black velvet cuffs framed her wrists. The collar was neat. The hem was perfect. The dress fit her exactly. Nellie stood straight. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't looking at the floor. She looked like a little girl who finally understood that she belonged exactly where she stood. Across the street, Harriet Gable dropped her purse. She recognized the fabric immediately. Nellie didn't look at her. She simply held her mother's hand. Josiah turned to Cora. Ready? Cora nodded. Yes. They walked into the bank. Arthur Gable stood immediately. His face had gone pale. He looked at the 6 ranch hands, then at Cora, then at Josiah. What is the meaning of this? You can't bring armed men into a bank. Josiah smiled slightly. They aren't armed. The cowboys opened their coats. Not one wore a gun belt. They're witnesses, and they have a story to tell. Arthur swallowed. I don't have time for stories. You are running a business. Josiah stepped closer. Now you're running out of time. He reached inside his coat, then placed a crumpled piece of paper on the desk. Arthur looked down. It was a confession. The two men from the night before had signed it. They were surprisingly willing to talk, Josiah said. Arthur's eyes moved toward the door. This proves nothing. Men will sign anything when they're frightened. The railroad needs that water. If Mrs. Thornton refuses to sell, the county can seize the land for public use. The railroad is powerful. Even you can't stop progress. Josiah remained calm. Arthur. Distant. Who do you think is paying for the new tracks? Arthur stared at him. What? The Northern Line. The steel comes from Pennsylvania. The timber comes from Oregon. And the money? Josiah leaned closer. It comes from me. Arthur slowly sank into his chair. The truth hit him all at once. Josiah Langdon wasn't merely a cattleman. He was the primary shareholder behind the railroad project. Arthur had spent months trying to force a widow off her farm so he could sell her land to a railroad company that Josiah already controlled. Josiah looked at him almost sympathetically. You didn't know. You thought you were being clever. You thought you could force a widow into default, buy her land for pennies and sell it to the railroad at a fortune. He paused. But you were trying to sell my own water back to me. The bank became completely silent. Cora stood beside him, stunned. She hadn't known either. Josiah reached inside his coat one final time. This time he pulled out a heavy legal document. It carried a golden seal. But instead of handing it to Arthur, Josiah turned toward Cora. Mrs. Thornton. He held it out. This is a 10-year lease agreement. Cora stared at the document. The Northern Line will pay you $600 every year for the right to run a water pipe from your creek to the new station. Cora's hands began to shake. $600 a year. It was more than enough to repair the farmhouse. Enough to replace the roof. Enough to buy cattle. Enough to send Nellie to the finest school in the state. Mr. Langdon. Cora's voice broke. I don't know what to say. Say yes. A tear rolled down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Yes. Josiah turned back toward Arthur. As for you, Arthur, I am withdrawing every Broken Ridge account from this bank. Every dollar. Unless you resign your position and leave Clearwater by sundown. Arthur looked around the room. He searched for someone who might defend him. Nobody did. Mr. Higgins stood near the back. He slowly shook his head. The townspeople stared at Arthur with disgust. His entire scheme had collapsed. His reputation was gone. His power was gone. And soon, his bank would be gone too. Josiah offered his arm to Cora. Shall we? Cora took it. We shall. They walked toward the door. The crowd parted. Near the entrance stood Harriet Cable. She had rushed over from the mercantile after hearing what happened. Her face was pale. The arrogance was gone. She looked at Cora. Then at Nellie. Nellie stood beside her mother wearing the bright red dress. She looked exactly like the child Harriet had mocked only yesterday. Except now she was standing taller. Harriet opened her mouth. No words came. Nellie didn't laugh. She didn't insult her. She didn't celebrate her humiliation. She simply remembered what her mother had taught her. Dignity keeps you standing. Nellie gave Harriet a polite nod. Then she walked out into the sunlight. By spring, the snow had disappeared from the valley. The railroad began laying tracks across the ridge. True to his word, Josiah's men installed the water pipe carefully. They made sure the Thornton pastures remained untouched. Arthur and Harriet Gable left Clearwater before the first thaw. They moved back east. Their large house stood empty. No one in town missed them. Cora kept her farm. She hired 2 men to repair the porch and replace the damaged roof. But she kept sewing. She made the winter shirts for Josiah's ranch hands. And she refused to accept a penny more than the agreed price. It wasn't because she needed the money. It was because she wanted the work to remain honest. Josiah continued visiting the farm. He would sit on the repaired porch with a cup of hot coffee while Eliza and Nellie ran through the spring grass. He never talked about the bank. He never reminded Cora about the debt. He never treated her like someone he had rescued. He simply treated her like an equal. Years passed. Nellie grew into an intelligent, educated young woman. Eventually, she traveled to the city. She wore silk. She wore lace. She had opportunities her mother could never have imagined. She never wanted for anything again. But she never forgot Clearwater. She never forgot the cold afternoon inside Higgins Mercantile. She never forgot the laughter. She never forgot the old gray dress. And she never forgot the tall cowboy standing quietly near the stove, the man who heard cruelty and decided not to ignore it. When Nellie eventually packed her trunk for college, she brought only a few things from home: her grandfather's faded parchment, a photograph of her mother, and at the very bottom of the trunk, folded carefully beneath her clothes, she placed one small piece of the old gray wool dress. She kept it for the rest of her life, not because she was ashamed of it, but because it reminded her of something she never wanted to forget. A person doesn't become valuable because of the clothes they wear. Money doesn't make someone honorable. And cruelty doesn't become acceptable simply because it comes from people wearing silk and fur. Sometimes dignity is nothing more than standing tall when the world wants you to bow your head. Sometimes kindness doesn't look like charity. Sometimes it looks like giving someone a chance to earn their way forward. And sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one who doesn't need to raise his voice. Josiah Langdon could have humiliated Harriet Gable that morning. He could have shouted at her. He could have reminded everyone in the store that he was richer and more powerful than she was. Instead, he bought the entire bolt of fabric. Then he went to the bank. He paid off a widow's debt. He uncovered a scheme to steal her farm. He protected her land, and he gave her something far more valuable than charity. He gave her a fair chance. As for Nellie, she carried that lesson with her for the rest of her life. The little girl who once stood beside a fabric counter wishing she could disappear eventually became a woman who never again allowed anyone's wealth, status, or cruel words to determine her worth. And that old gray dress? She never threw it away. She kept one small piece of it tucked safely in her trunk. Because sometimes the things that hurt us the most become the things that remind us how strong we really were. And that is how one cold afternoon in Clearwater changed the lives of a widow, her daughter, and a millionaire cowboy who simply refused to let cruelty have the final word.